Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to begin. Running a little bit late. Ambassador Stevens will be with us at about 4 o'clock. He's coming a bit later. Otherwise, the panel, as you see them, are the ones on your program. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Welcome you here on behalf of the Wilson Center, on behalf of the of our co-sponsors, Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and the partnership for, oh my gosh, Julie, I forgot the name of your partnership.
Partnership to Cut Hunger in Africa. Excuse me.
To cut hunger and poverty in Africa. You see, that's why one forgets. For those of you who aren't familiar, and I'm sure most of you are, the Wilson Center is the official monument to former President Woodrow Wilson. And one of the things that's unique about this is that it's established for bringing together the world of ideas and policy. Wilson having been the only American president to ever have a PhD and to be a true academic, president of Princeton University, as I'm sure you all know. And his ideal was that policy would be better informed by those of us who work in the field, who are in academia, who are practitioners. And so those are the kinds of things that we try to do here at the Wilson Center, and this is a perfect example of bringing together those who've been looking at issues of and working in the field in issues of food security. Now, obviously, when you look at the problems that are besetting Africa, and they are myriad and many, but if you think in the long term, probably water management, water resource management, obviously environmental degradation, sustainable environmental protection, and food security are the longest term, most important issues that you can think about. Will have the longest lasting and most profound effects. So we are very happy to have together with us today the persons on the podium here who will be discussing these issues for you. My role is your host and moderator, so I won't be up here very long. I'm going to introduce Marshall Bouton, who is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We're very, very happy to have him here. He's going to introduce our first two speakers, who will be talking about the work and the research that they've done in the terms of the book Enough that they've just published, and which is going to be available later. We'll talk about that as we go along. We will have responses to their presentation, and then, as is the habit of the Woodrow Wilson Center, we will have a lot of time for discussion, question, and answer afterwards. So you'll get to enter the fray. Let me introduce Marshall very quickly. He is the president, I said, of Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He has worked for 20 years with the Asia Society in New York as its chief operating officer and chief executive vice president. And I'm not sure, but Marshall sounded awfully familiar to me before today, and it may be that we've worked together before, because I was executive vice president of African American Institute throughout the 1990s, and I know we worked closely with the Asia Society, and could have been. But anyway, let me bring Marshall up to introduce Scott and Roger, and lead right into their presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, and I want to thank the Wilson Center for hosting this event and the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa, and Julie Howard, who are the true organizers of the event. And we've worked and had the privilege of working closely with the partnership. In fact, the partnership was Julie herself, a key advisor to the recent Chicago Council project on renewing American leadership in global agriculture, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We also are fortunate at the Chicago Council to have a connection with the book Enough that you will hear about from Roger Thurow and Scott Kilman. We were privileged to provide a home for their work, and that it came out of their own, very much out of their own long experience and deep commitment to these issues. They are an exceptional team, not only because both of them are very accomplished and distinguished journalists, but because their areas of expertise complement and overlap with each other's in ways that were provided a perfect team to do this exceptional book. Roger's experience has been mostly outside the United States, behalf of the Wall Street Journal in Europe and in Africa. Scott's has been primarily in domestic U.S. agricultural issues, but also dealing with the international forces in agriculture. And so they come together to create what I believe will be a seminal work at a particularly important moment in what is now a shifting focus of the entire global community to the importance of food security. It was more than a generation ago that we had the Green Revolution and thought these problems of global food security had been resolved. The food price crisis last year reminded us all that unfortunately they are not. And in fact, in some parts of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, they've become more acute. So enough has provided both the analytical background, the history, and the moral argument and the political argument of why the international community must now say enough and move forward to address the problem of global hunger. So I think we're starting with Roger.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go back to the beginning. I think we're seeing this as a touchy machine, so any kind of it's going to advance things along. Thank you very much, Marshall, and thanks to you for, as he alluded to, the assistance and support the Chicago Council gave us in the writing of the book at times, and thanks to Julie and the partnership for, there we go again, for setting this up, and I figured out what bar it is. I'll try to avoid the, for not only organizing this, but for the great support, encouragement, advice, inspiration during the many years of reporting the book, also while we were still reporting stories for the Wall Street Journal that led into the book. So that's great, and thanks for that. And thanks everybody for coming. You know, gee, we had no idea when we set off on our odyssey and our excellent adventure of writing this book that it would arrive and land at such a fortuitous time, and certainly didn't know it would come out at a time when everybody from President Obama and the Congress, all the NGOs, everybody here is vitally interested in this, and as Marshall said, one of the big driving issues in the world today of world diplomacy, of parliaments and heads of state. And so it's great because the book, we hope to provide both a cautionary, instructional, and also inspirational tale that hunger can be conquered. And as I'm Roger, by the way, that's Scott. As we double teamed the book, we'll also double team this presentation. We will try to expeditiously move through some of the slides to give you an idea of some of the people and characters and places that are in the book, and then hopefully leave plenty of room for Franklin's discussion and the ambassador, and plenty of room for question and answer, which is the liveliest part of any discussion. Just want to say our purpose in writing the book was to help stir a constituency of people like yourselves, and certainly far beyond this room and far beyond the salons of Washington, but throughout the grassroots of the United States and abroad, and build on this constituency of people to build on this new momentum that Marshall had talked about, and reverse neglect of agriculture development, as Marshall also talked about, and how this issue basically fell off the end of the table after the Green Revolution, and in the resulting hunger that has come from that neglect. And in writing it, we kind of had a daily mantra that we would recite out loud, or we'd mumble to ourselves. Outrage and inspire. Outrage and inspire is what we wanted to do. Both outrage by some of the examples that we'll be seeing that we've come to this point and brought hunger with us into the 21st century at ever increasing rates and ever increasing numbers, and also inspire that conquering hunger is something that truly is achievable and can become a signature achievement of our generation. What we wanted to do when we set out was to show that the chronic hunger of today is largely man-made. Certainly there's natural disasters that come along. Drought, unfortunately, is becoming more frequent cycles in certain parts of Africa. The tsunami that we saw in Asia a couple of years ago and the effect that has on hunger and food production. And of course, hunger follows in the wake of war, conflict, and corruption. But so much of today's hunger is also caused by policies, by decisions that we make here in the United States and in Europe and other parts of the rich developed world that basically span the political spectrum. And that's why it gives us the hope and the inspiration that the hunger is avoidable and can be conquered. On my first day in Ethiopia of the Ethiopian famine of 2003 in Addis Ababa, during the horrible famine that had struck the country that year, I was given some cautionary advice by Voli Karuchi, who was the water expert at the World Food Program we met the day before he was taking us out to some of the hunger zones. What he said was both very striking to me then and has continued to kind of haunt me, be in the back of our minds, and kind of also a guiding principle as we wrote the book. What Voli said was, looking into the eyes of someone dying of hunger becomes a disease of the soul. You see that nobody should have to die of hunger. When I then went down to the famine zones and looked into the eyes of the starving Ethiopians in 2003, some of the things that I saw beyond the personal tragedy that was happening were neglect, hypocrisy, ignorance, good intentions gone bad. You could see the impact of farm subsidy policy, food aid policies, the ever-expanding ethanol situation that was then, the self-interest of the Western countries in dealing with some of these issues. You could also see that agricultural development and the goal of reducing hunger, kind of means more than just production, boosting production. It also means trade. It means getting the markets right and dealing with policies. And so what we're going to do is let's now go to Ethiopia in 2003 and look into some of those eyes. And these people are some of the folks that are in the book. Some of the photos are part of the book. And you'll kind of see some of the instances that we are talking about and that we describe in the book. In this slide, what we have is, I guess you will have to turn around. Hopefully you won't crane your necks too much if you guys can get comfortable. It is an emergency feeding tent in the southern region of Ethiopia, in the highland plateau of Berecha. And what we have here, kind of this is in essence kind of almost a strange spotlight on the little boy, Hargirso. These are, as I said, emergency feeding tents. They were filled with 166 children who were dying of starvation at the time. And Hargirso is the boy in the white, is 5 years old in this picture, and his father carried him into the emergency feeding tent, and he was only weighing 27 pounds. He has the typical look of someone with extreme malnutrition. The swollen head from the edema, the bone-thin arms and legs of the little child. Next to him, too, that's their fathers sitting behind them, peasant farmers. And as somebody invariably points out every time we give this demonstration and show this, the demographics, obviously, and many of you know, of farming in Africa is that most of the farmers are women. In this case, I think it was the fathers who brought the children into the emergency feeding tents. The wives, the mothers of the children, would be back home on the farms, taking care of the farms and the other children that are there. And the point that we want to make with this and what this illustrates is kind of the strange situation that these peasant farmers found themselves in. And this year, this is May 2003, carrying their starving children into the emergency feeding tents of this town of Berecha. Just 1 year earlier, to the same town of Berecha and to the market area, just on the other side of these emergency feeding tents, they were carrying their big 100 kilogram bags of surplus crops, mainly maize in this area of the country, some beans, and peas. Because what happened with the famine of 2003 in Ethiopia, it was preceded by 2 years of bumper harvest. These farmers, the larger commercial farmers in the country, had ostensibly the best harvests of their lives, both in the 01, 02, 01 and 01, 02 farming seasons. What happens in Ethiopia and much of the rest of Africa, where the markets were not properly developed and fully developed, is all the harvest comes on the market at the same time. If the harvest's not that great, that's okay. It's quickly absorbed into the system. 2 years of bumper harvest, you can imagine what happened, particularly the second year. There was a huge glut in the country, particularly when all the grain came to the market at the same time. Prices collapsed catastrophically. They collapsed 80% in Ethiopia that year at the end of 2002. These guys responded. So when Tesfaye, the father of Harki or so, sitting behind him and basically holding him up so he doesn't fall over, when Tesfaye bought his surplus grain to the market, he suffered a loss. The price he got was below the cost of his inputs and his farming effort. So these guys reacted in the same way that farmers anywhere else in the world did. These were the peasant farmers. The commercial farmers in Ethiopia, who may be farming 1,200, 3,000, or 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 acres of land. Some of those guys that I talked to that had their best farms and best crops ever, they lost $250,000 with the price collapse. Their response was, these guys and also the commercial farmers, was, as I said, farmers anywhere else in the world, they cut back on expenses. What they do, they cut back on their use of fertilizer. Fertilizer use in Ethiopia the next planting year, so beginning of 2003, fell 27%. They stopped using the more expensive hybrid seed. They used whatever kind of common seed they had laying around. The use of hybrid seed, better producing seed, fell 70%. Some of the commercial farmers shut off their irrigation systems because they couldn't afford them anymore. The expectations were, and of these farmers, was, yeah, we're not using, our inputs are decreased. We're expecting a smaller harvest, but that's okay as long as we can grow enough to feed our families. Because what good was the surplus? We just lost money in the surplus. The lack of markets in the country to be able to absorb the surplus sapped their incentive, and they said, well, we'll just grow enough as we can to feed our families. All of Ethiopia looked heavenward for rain. Drought hit. Hunger started. After a couple of months of people selling off their assets, famine spread. The same farmers who the year before were bringing in their surplus grain to the same market were all of a sudden bringing in their starving children. And so what happened was you kind of had the cruel paradox of, and in almost a biblical sense, that feast gave way to famine. From the farmer's success, in a great cruel irony, came their failure. After the famine of 1984, that was also epic in proportion, there was the huge push to produce. They did produce. They had their bumper crops. The markets were neglected. The infrastructure, as Marshall alluded to, was neglected. There were no roads to move the crops. The private sector was undeveloped. In essence, the markets failed before the weather did. So the lesson is markets matter. Other peasant farmers, also their children being brought in year before, surplus bags of grain the next year, starving children. That's how quickly things can turn around. Hey, what's this picture? This is German Amente. He's one of the larger commercial traders in the country, also a farmer. This is his warehouse outside of Addis Ababa. These are some of the stacks of grain that from the surplus harvest of the years before. These guys kept it back. It's in the warehouse because to have released it would have further reduced prices. And as we spoke, there was no market that was able to absorb the surplus anyway. So these guys were sitting on this grain and storing it in their warehouses. Here's some other pictures. That's German. He scrambled to the top of his stack of grain and basically laughed and said ironically to me, and sarcastically, Roger, take my picture, put the caption of the paper in the Wall Street Journal, please send food to Ethiopia, we have no grain. And the picture didn't run into Wall Street Journal. We weren't that graphically oriented at that time, but now German is getting the last laugh by having this shown. Another stunning picture, all Ethiopian grown grain. Now what was happening here, just to illustrate another problem, and one of the things that I had mentioned is this is in the town of Nazareth. It's one of the main kind of transport commercial centers in Ethiopia, where a lot of the food comes into. It's also on the road from Djibouti on the coast to Addis Ababa. It's over this road where all the American and all the food aid came into the country that year. If you went out into the parking lots of these warehouses and stood there, you could actually feel the ground rumbling as the huge double-wide truck wagons filled with American food aid came rushing into the country. These guys will very much applaud that. You know, the American food aid was coming into the country. It saved thousands of millions of lives of starving Ethiopians that year. There were about 14 million Ethiopians that had to be fed by the outside world in 2003. But what these guys were asking their government, since they had all this grain already there, and they were truly perplexed, celebrating the American grain coming in, saving a lot of starving Ethiopians, but also asking the question, hey, can somebody please buy our grain first? And as most of you probably know, the American food aid system then was, it had to be American grown grain and shipped on American flagged vessels, so the flexibility wasn't there to have the local and regional purchase, which Julie and her group is one that has been very much dealing with that issue. USAID on that issue, and now kind of there's pilot projects that are looking at that. And the strange irony and situation arose that these guys and these grain traders, when I was there, they were writing a letter to their government saying, please, can you tell the donors of food aid, hey, thank you for the food aid, but can someone also donate cash so somebody can buy this? Because if somebody doesn't buy this grain, we're not going to have the money to buy the grain from the farmers at the next harvest time, nor are we going to have any room to store it. The other debilitating effect of this is when some of the farmers were bringing some of their grain to the market, and in Nazareth there's a crossroads coming, the food's coming up from the south, from the main wheat belt of the country, the other food aid coming over from Djibouti. When some of the farmers would see the American food aid coming into the country, they basically turned around and went back home. They stored the grain there. Within a couple of months, a couple of weeks, it goes bad from their storage facilities are not good. It goes bad from the weather, from the rodents, from whatever is able to get to it. So these guys are writing this letter to their government saying, can somebody please donate money to buy this grain first? At the same time, Scott's talking to American farmers in the U.S., and he's out in the Palouse area of the country in Washington State, where some of the farmers are very dependent on food aid.
Selling grain for food aid.
Exactly, selling grain for the food aid program. And so there was a group of American farmers, and primarily, I guess, the wheat farmers at the time, who were writing a letter to the White House. At the same time that these guys were writing a letter to their government, the American farmers were writing a letter to the White House asking, hey, please, they had a good harvest of wheat in the United States. That same effect is in Ethiopia, putting pressure on the prices. So these American farmers were writing to the White House saying, hey, can you put more wheat in the American food aid system to relieve the pressure on the prices here? So what you had in the conclusion of some of these Ethiopians, and they would just, state it bluntly, and it was hard to refute them at the time, is that the American farmers need starving Ethiopians. Because why wasn't their grain being bought? These two guys are lentil farmers in Ethiopia. They were standing alongside the road from Djibouti when I came across them. They have their own lentil fields, not far away from the road. They'd come down from the field. And they too, there was a convoy of food aid trucks coming into the country. These guys themselves were on food aid, so they were, okay, this is great, here comes the food aid in the country. And as the trucks rumbled over the road, there was some of the cargo that spilled out and fell down on the road. Trucks are passed, these guys are curious, they run out of the road. Well, gee, what's falling down here? I was curious, I followed with them. These lentil farmers, they bent over and picked up what had fallen down, and lo and behold, they were lentils. And they said, lentils, why are lentils coming into the country? Don't they know that we grow lentils here? We have some lentils left over from our surplus. We're growing lentils now in the field. Who's bringing lentils into the country? And these two guys kind of are a good illustration of the kind of the skewed numbers and relationships that one saw in 2003. That again gets to the policy issues and some of the things, some of the decision issues. That in that year of 2003, $500 million worth of American food aid came into the country, and again, much to be welcome, saved thousands, millions of lives. $500 million of food aid. That same year, American spending on agriculture development in Ethiopia was less than $5 million. So here's the relationship. $500 million of food aid coming into the country to feed starving Ethiopians, less than $500 million of agriculture development aid going to Ethiopia to help the farmers be more productive and grow more crops so they wouldn't be hungry in the first place and needing the food aid. So you had this terribly skewed relationship. These guys then are also indicative of the neglect that Marshall talked about and kind of how agriculture development spending fell off a cliff in the 1980s and 1990s, that there was no development spending or any support for these guys. This man with the scarf, the turban on his head, scarf twirled into a turban, his name is Tesfahun Belichu. Tesfahun in Amharic means be hope. And when I came across Tesfahun, he was basically utterly bereft of hope, was the exact opposite meaning of his name almost mocking him in a sense. He and his family were on food aid for the past 9 months. His field, which was a little bit off beyond this river, was parched dry from the drought. Whatever he was growing had died, and as I said, the result of that was his family was hungry and he was on food aid. You'll notice the river running past him, the Rib River. Obvious question comes to my mind, gee, why don't you take some of that water and irrigate your land? You know, he fixes me with a stare that of unbelief that we're not. I'm not an idiot. Of course, we've thought of that. One, he answered, we have no money to build an irrigation system. And two, we've tried with little kind of crude systems, but the Ethiopian authorities would come by and say, you can't be using this water for irrigation. The reason is the Rib River is one of the tributaries of the Blue Nile River, which is one of the great waterways of Africa. And during the international water treaties and conventions, it was determined that the Blue Nile water rights belong to the downstream users, Sudan and Egypt. They were ruled by and administered by the British at the time. The Ethiopians had the great fortune of never being colonized, but they also had the great misfortune of never being colonized because of the great councils of Europe where they decided, well, what's going on with Africa, particularly water rights, they didn't have a representation really. And so 85% of the water of the Great Nile, the Blue Nile runs into Sudan, Khartoum meets up with the White Nile coming up from the Great Lakes region. Together they form the Great Nile, which steams on into Egypt and makes the desert bloom. And they calculate that 80 to 85% of the water in the Great Nile running through Egypt comes from the highlands of Ethiopia, either from the Blue Nile or from other tributaries that are flowing into the Nile. 85% of the water in the Nile in Egypt coming from the highlands of Ethiopia. In 2003, that water in Egypt, 85% of it being from Ethiopia, was irrigating about 8 million acres of land of the desert, basically in Egypt. In 2003 in Ethiopia, home of the Blue Nile, source of the Blue Nile, source of 85% of that water, less than 500,000 acres were irrigated. So it is as if it was kind of the cruel irony that we wrote about then in our stories, that the land that feeds the Nile can't feed itself. Here's some of the water from the Blue Nile. This man is a farmer in Egypt. His farm is 100 kilometers from the Nile. The water stretches from the Nile out to through a series of canals to his farm. He's the last stop along the Nile canal system. If he wants to expand his farm, you got to expand the canal system. These are water buffalo calves, I think. They're being showered by the Nile from the water. or by the water from the Nile. As he says, you know, kind of happy calves mean fatter calves means more money for him. The water coming out of the showers is again from the Nile, and basically 85% of that water is coming from Ethiopia. Oops. So there's Tesfahun, who can't use his water. Oh, I can't figure this out. And there's this farmer in Egypt using the water, some of the water that's running past Tesfahun's feet. Now we'll move into Scott's part of the presentation. He's our subsidies expert.
Keep going. I like the way you do these two next pictures.
I'll set these guys up. This is now we're in 2002. This is in Mali. These are Mali cotton farmers. You can see how they're dressed. They have little sandals on, but they do all their work by hand, by feet. They're walking behind 2 oxen to prepare their field. I think this was in May, early June of 2002. Rains had just started falling. Rains are falling. Farmer said, "Oop, we got to scramble to the fields, get the fields ready for to plant." I think these guys had like maybe 15 acres or something. It's all done by manual. This is Ken Hood. He's the head of, what is it called, the National Cotton Council. He's in the Mississippi Delta. Scott took this picture. I took the picture of the guys in Mali. Pictures were taken on the very same day. We kind of arranged that. It was, we figured, a very good glimpse into the subsidy system and the way that works and the international impact that can have. I was in Mali, in the Malian cotton fields. Scott was in the cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta. Cotton in Mali is maybe supporting 3 million people from the cotton farmers in Mali, and of course, cotton always long been king of the Mississippi Delta. Mr. Hood is behind a very wonderful piece of equipment, technological marvel, which is great. You need that to farm cotton in the United States. It's steered by GPS. It'll measure what, Scott, how much fertilizer goes on every square centimeter of land.
That's the planter will do that. That's a harvester.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a harvester.
Scott knows his way around farms better than I do. Franklin obviously does too. I think even Marshall does, but that's okay. See, Scott, I said you should do these photos, so.
How can you do that?
Well, whatever this thing is. It's a contraption that costs a lot of money. So the question is, you look at these two guys, which one do you think would get the subsidies to farm, some farm aid to help him be a better farmer? This guy, who's kind of wearing rags and walking behind his oxen in, you know, bare feet or little sandals, or this man who is, you know, dressed very finely and has wonderful equipment? The answer, obviously, is the American cotton farmers. And so I don't know if, Scott, if you want to kind of explain the relationship of the subsidies. And the reason so this was in late May, early June of 2002. If you know the time frame then, the Farm Bill had just been signed. That Farm Bill of 2002 greatly increased subsidies to American farmers. The cotton farmers were, I think, the beneficiaries of the biggest raise. And when President Bush turned around to shake hands with those at the signing ceremony, the first one he shook hands with was, I believe, Mr. Hood. And so, Scott, we'll do this in a couple of the other photos to come.
And how are we doing on time? How much
we
more
okay?
for this segment?
Yeah, we've just consulted, and Marshall's going to give up his time, and you guys keep going. You got 15 minutes.
Oh, no, we'll want to hear from Marshall. I don't know if this is
More importantly,
Marshall's already sacrificed a lot. He said we used his offices as a home, and I ruined the carpet in one of his offices by spilling coffee. So this is just another. But I'll try to be quick. But what we're trying to show with this the parallel between these two farmers at this time, the Doha round was beginning, and the whole push behind the Doha round was to show the West was recognizing that their subsidies would have an impact on the developing world, and cotton really became the cotton subsidies really became the center of that, because one thing that West Africa is good at is exporting cotton. And the Africans, the West Africans, were saying, you know, we need to be able to compete fairly with U.S. farmers. U.S. farmers, the argument went, receive subsidies, production-based subsidies, which inherently encourage them to produce more and which depresses prices. Most economists agree on that. What they disagree is the extent that happens. So we were trying to show how a subsidy program in the United States has been around for a very long time. There really hadn't been a debate, a recognition that it was having an impact, and that it was generating complaints in Africa. And the U.S. government was just coming to the realization of that. Indeed, if you talk to farmers in Mississippi and politicians there, they didn't realize that. Anyway, so that's the example we have in the book about cotton. This is Norman Borlaug, and growing up in Iowa, he was one of my childhood heroes. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, and he's sort of famous for not being famous. He's famous for probably saving more lives than anybody else that's certainly ever won a Nobel Peace Prize, but he's very obscure. In the United States, he isn't really recognized, but if he goes to the Punjab, or if he goes, as I did with him, to Mexico, it's huge front page news. And the reason he's important, so the thing that stuck in my mind why I was interested in writing about him in the book is that when you tackle a book that tries to, when you do a book that tries to tackle the issue of hunger and how to tackle hunger, it's daunting, because you realize that there are a million problems. And so how can you write something that would give anybody hope that they could have any impact? And then what you start to realize is if there are a million problems, it means there's a million solutions. And if there's a million solutions, those can be things that are very, a slice that one person can have an impact. So here's a guy who became known as a great humanitarian, saved a lot of lives, but that was never really his intention. He worked for the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1940s and was given a task of growing wheat seed for poor farmers in Mexico. There were seed companies that were selling to these poor farmers. He was the Monsanto and the DuPont of his day, only he had a lot less to work with. And in his work, when you read the book, he was an unusual scientist. He did things in an unusual way. But through his work, he came up with a miracle strain of wheat, so that when India and Pakistan were the begging bowl nations in the 60s and the early 70s, he had wheat that could be shipped over and planted quickly by farmers into India and Pakistan. He and many others worked on the Green Revolution. He's often identified and given the most credit. But you can point to his wheat and how his wheat, the way he developed his wheat, was then used to develop strains of rice, so that Asia and Pakistan went from, in the 60s, being begging bowl nations. I think India was consuming something like 20% of all the wheat grown in the United States as food aid in some years in the 1960s. By the 1980s, it grew enough to actually export in some years. An amazing transformation, something that in a decade, 15 years' time, nobody ever thought could happen. So to me, he's an example of a guy, and he's 95 years old, still alive. Saw him a few weeks ago. Oh, yeah. Yep. This is 2 years ago. Now he would have been 93. And this is a visit that he and I took to Mexico into the breeding fields where he did his work. And he's actually standing by the ancestors of the seeds that he grew. I think that's a 1948 or 1950 variety that's still kept, that students from around the world can come and spend time with him and see his work in the field. This is a picture. Roger was talking about how the eyes of the hungry haunt you. Another example we have in the book. So the first half of the book is really, sort of grim. It explains how we were able to make a big dent in hunger in the 60s and 70s and in Asia, but then how the world lost its way in the 80s and the 90s and Africa was neglected. Then we get to the second half of the book and we look at people who are trying to make a difference now. This generation's, Norman Borlaug's. And this is a story about a man who's has a very famous name, but nobody really knows about him. This picture was taken by Howard Buffett, who's the son of Warren Buffett, and who's an amateur photographer and a farmer in Illinois, and who has the great fortune to be the son of Warren Buffett, one of his 3 children. And Warren has started to give money to his children's foundations, which are all aimed at humanitarian causes. So the story here is that Howard had been a conservationist. Being a farmer in Iowa, he was interested in nature and he was interested in photography. Those 2 things worked together. So he got involved. He takes a lot of pictures of polar bears, almost got eaten by one. and was very interested in conservation issues in the United States. In the 1990s, he started working for a company that had business in South Africa. And so he was going to South Africa to sell grain bins to large commercial farmers, and got interested in conservation in Africa, and got interested in cats, and has a cheetah preserve in Africa. But the more time he spent there, the more he began to realize that you really couldn't make a dent in the conservation problems of Africa until you help people feed themselves, because he saw that the poor people of Africa, most of whom are poor farmers, were degrading the land and pushing wildlife off land. They had to keep putting more and more land to production and not doing it very well, and that was taking land away from wildlife. So he actually came to realize that through a couple things that happened to him. One of them was a flight over the Serengeti, where he saw farmers doing slash and burn agriculture. And then another was this picture that he took in Tamale in North Ghana, where he was traveling with, I think it was with World Vision, and they took him through a hospital. And he took a picture of this little girl who was starving to death. And with this picture, we describe how in the book this is an epiphany for him, because he's looking through his viewfinder and he's looking right into the eyes of this girl. And he has 5 children of his own. And it's the first time that the hopelessness of this situation really hit him. And this girl died shortly after this picture was taken. And he carried this with him for a long time, and he realized that, I'm in an unusual situation. I have money that I can make a difference in any cause that I want to make. And it could be supporting the arts, or supporting the opera, or beautification of our highway ditches. And he basically took the hardest route possible, which is he spends a lot of his time now in Africa, going to the roughest parts of Africa, trying to support agricultural development and work with the hungry and the poor. And there he is. I love this picture of Howard because he's got this big gouge on his arm. That's not the cheetah. He has a cheetah bite on the other arm. But he's one of these guys who's not like his dad at all, who likes to stay in the office and work over numbers. He's always falling off equipment just like I am. This is one other character in the book.
Yep, I'll begin here. This is a woman who is known very well to a number of people in the room. This is Eleni Gabra Madin. She's an Ethiopian economist. If you remember from the earlier slides when we were talking about people hadn't paid attention to the markets, Eleni is someone who for 20 years was almost crying and shouting in the wilderness. We got to get the markets right. We got to get the markets right. The production's great. We need the production. You got to get the markets right. If they're not, it's going to be a horrible blow to the incentive, catastrophically for the farmers. Spent many years in this city. And here she is ringing the bell of the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange, because out of the famine of 2003, everything crystallized in her mind, probably more so than it had before, and also in the minds of the Ethiopian government and a lot of the NGOs and folks who were working on the problem. Their markets matter. And so she and the Ethiopian government together, and then with the private sector, they basically got together and formed the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange, which opened in April of 2008, exactly 160 years and 1 day to the opening of the Chicago Board of Trade. We've had that technology. Our farmers have had the price discovery mechanisms of the Board of Trade, of the sharing the risk of farming, sharing the risk of prices, of futures contracts by the Board of Trade and commodities exchanges. 160 years took to finally get to Ethiopia to give farmers that incentive. Again, we show this, outrage and inspire Norman Borlaug, Howard Buffett, Eleni, some of the inspiring things, what one people can do, really determined to found this exchange. And she was the subject of a PBS Wine Angle show, I think it was last week sometime. So if you go to the PBS Wine Angle, you can see that documentary and learn more about Eleni there.
It's a good place to end it.
Yeah, we'll end it there. So I don't know if we took to Marshall's full 15 minutes. You got 3 minutes left. But some people will say, well, one of the reasons also for writing the book, and I was at a nonfiction writing conference in Dallas last week, and Paul Thurow, the great travel writer, same last name as mine, but spelled differently and much more famous in literary scenes. He said every story needs a reason to be told. This hunger story, you know, one of the reasons that we write about it for the paper and why we did the book goes back to that first cautionary advice I got in Ethiopia back in 2003. Nobody should have to die of hunger, and so that's what motivates us, and that's the reason to keep writing this story. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Roger and Scott. Very evoking presentation. Here's how the agenda will proceed from now on, but let me start at the end. We will have time for questions and answers and be able to have some exchange here, but you all are invited to a reception in the foyer after 5 o'clock when we end this presentation, where there will be books for sale, and of course Roger and Scott will be there to personally and informally take your questions and fill in a lot of the gaps and blanks of what they've been discussing here. Marshall very eloquently and generously has foregone his time because we are running a little bit late, although we may come back to it because Ambassador Bockari Stevens is not here yet. He's to be on the agenda a bit later, so we'll see how it unfolds. But I would like to turn now, and it's very appropriate, to Franklin, who has been with us before many a time. Franklin Moore is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID, very experienced in this field, has worked in USAID for a number of years in agricultural issues, amongst others, and besides a Peace Corps background and other things, has also lectured and taught around the United States and in Ghana, as I see from the CV. So he brings a lot of experience to us. He's going to talk about the U.S. response and President Obama's views on agricultural development and food security in Africa. So let's turn it over to Franklin for the moment.
Can I do that from here?
You may indeed.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to come to Woodrow Wilson yet again. You've just seen a variety of issues that contribute to problems of food insecurity in the world. I'm not going to really sort of talk about planning as it relates to the variety of issues that they have laid out, although I will probably say something about some of their issues that they mentioned. I can't help but saying that at least for one of them, you certainly don't have to go to Ethiopia to see farmers who have fields that watch water pass through it. All you have to do is go to the western part of the United States to see that. And when we deal with water rights is one of the strangest and things on the face of the earth. But you know, if you're from the western part of the United States, you know that many people who live along the Colorado River also don't have rights to the water in the Colorado River. That those rights also go to end users. I just have to point that out because that's one of the things of the world that's one of those strange things that I guess I never really quite understood. And looking at the response to food insecurity, there has been a lot of work over the past couple of months. I think most people who have paid attention to food and food security are aware that President Obama, when he went to the G20 summit in London, talked about his request to double U.S. assistance in agriculture. This follows upon two things in his earlier history. During the campaign, he talked about adding value to agriculture. And for those who remember his inaugural address, he talked about providing assistance to farmers in other countries. So he personally has been quite seized by food insecurity and its response. In conversations he has had with the Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton, she has taken on that task for him and has organized AID, State Department, MCC, some of PEPFAR, to begin to look at responses to food insecurity, and to do that in a whole-of-government form that has an interagency component. So I'm going to talk just very briefly about some of the highlights of that planning. It currently is going under the title Seeking a World Without Hunger. Seeking a World Without Hunger is interested in reversing chronic hunger, but there are two things that are heavily associated with that. One of those is reducing poverty, and the other is reducing malnutrition. And the views have been that those three things, and if you paid attention not only to what you saw in some of the earlier figures, but some of the links between the earlier figures, those three things are very interrelated, and it would be very difficult, we think, to try to have an effect on one of those without having an effect on all of those. So the initiative is interested in both reducing hunger, reducing poverty, improving nutrition, and doing this in a way that strengthens the agriculture sector. Let me make a quick remark on that. As we look at the chronically hungry and the poor, if we are going to lay them out in this world, 50% of them are farmers. They are rural by residence. They live on enough land that, if productive, can provide not only for their needs and their family needs, but can produce a marketable surplus. That's 50%. There's another 10%, most of whom are rural residents, who are involved in livestock or are fish persons. So that takes you to 60% that are clearly agriculturally based. There's another 20% that are rural by residency. They either are landless or on plots of land too small really to meet their own needs. And then there's about 20% that are urban. So this reducing hunger, poverty, and improving nutrition while strengthening the agriculture sector is clearly targeting the first 60% I talked about. Some of what I say in this targeting will also have an effect on portions of those other 40%. But one of the things I need to say as we begin to look at how we strengthen the ag sector to do this, there are many people who ask the question, well, the United States is the largest deliverer of emergency food, and it has been pointed out the vast majority of that is food grown in the United States and shipped from the United States. This effort to increase agricultural productivity in the rest of the world and also to reduce poverty and increase nutrition is really not an either-or with emergency food. It's not we do this and we eliminate all needs for emergency food. The reality is there will continue to be natural disasters, there will continue to be man-made disasters, there will be a continuing need for emergency food, and even as we engage in local purchase of food for emergencies, if we were to purchase the food that was in the warehouse that was shown there, there probably still will be a variety of situations where emergency food that is grown in the United States will still need to be shipped elsewhere in the world. So we're not looking at this as an either-or. Our whole concept of total food security has some short run, medium, and long run. The pieces I'm talking about deal more with the medium and long run. In putting this together, before I get to some of the categories, we have been very dependent upon some consultations. Included in those consultations are clearly the work of the Chicago Council, Clearly the work of the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty, but also there is a group that has put together what is called the Roadmap to End Hunger. We have also done a fair amount of consultation with the Interaction Food Security and Agriculture Working Group, and we've done consultations with a variety of private sector organizations to get it where we are. We're looking at what, and here are some things that I think are new and different. One is that we see this as a much more comprehensive ag sector-led growth and improved nutrition. And when I give you sort of our idea of 7 boxes, you'll see why I say that. But before I get to that, we also see it very much as investing in what are country-led plans, ideas, and activities. And that is critically important. It is critically important in the discussion of policies that was had. It is critically important that we partner with countries who are looking at policies and their own activities in agriculture in a way that is quite different. You talked about the early Green Revolution. The early Green Revolution had a couple of advantages. It took place primarily initially in India and Pakistan, both of them very large countries, where when decisions tended to be made for the country, they were made for a huge number of farmers at one time. And the other thing, if you talk to Norman Borlaug about it, they were very successful at using the rivalry between India and Pakistan to introduce a variety of new techniques, new crops, etc. Quite often, if Pakistan was resistant, what Dr. Borlaug tells me they used to say to him is, oh, we wonder why you're resistant to this. You know, the Indians are planting this. And it was very useful in helping them to move forward technologies, etc. So we would like to be working with partners who have themselves looked at their own agricultural needs in a different way. A large portion of this will be in Africa, a portion will be in South Asia, and another portion will be in Central America. In Africa, we have the advantage of the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, or CAADP. 2 tenets of CAADP are that a country should move to investing at least 10% of its own budget in agriculture. And another is that it should be looking at its policies so that it has at least a 6% per year growth rate in the agricultural sector. And those are critically important in helping to reorient how those countries are looking at agriculture for themselves. But let me give you some idea of some of the activities that we think are critically important. The first one is productivity. Clearly, productivity needs to continue to increase. Productivity needs to continue to increase, often in conditions that are quite different from the conditions that are best for agriculture. And Africa is a continent. Africa is the driest continent on the face of the earth. It is 71% arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid. Agricultural technique needs to be adjusted to those conditions, as does the use of inputs. So that productivity box is very dependent upon 2 other boxes. One is agricultural research that begins to adopt both crops and technique or technology to the areas where agriculture will take place. And that's critically important. And the other is natural resource management. One of the downsides of the Green Revolution as it rolled into Asia is that there probably was not as much attention to natural resource management as would be useful. And one of the things that occurred was the mining of water. And they are beginning to pay some of the price for the mining of that water in their agricultural productivity. So any sort of new, I tend not to use the word green revolution, but any new increase in productivity will have to be mindful of that. So that's the third box, natural resource management. When we look at agriculture in the places that lag in agriculture, one of the other things we find is that on average 70% of the agriculture that takes place at the hands of women. The picture you saw from Mali is in some ways unusual. It's unusual in that, I mean, I would like to follow the whole agricultural pursuit there, because what you saw in Mali was not necessarily the agriculture, you saw the land preparation. And as one looks at the conversion of agriculture, understand it's a basic conversion from hunting and gathering, where women who gathered tend to crops, and men who hunted tend to animals, and there are many cases where men play a role in land preparation, and that is the end of their role in the agricultural cycle. 70% women, so a concentration on women is critically important. That's the fourth box. And that concentration on women includes some things that people don't normally think we should be including or wonder why we're including it, and I will give you an example. If a woman receives a bag of fertilizer and the instructions on that bag of fertilizer are written for someone who has a 6th grade education, and women in that village only have 3rd grade educations, they cannot read the bag of fertilizer for its application. So there are a variety of things, training, education, etc., that go along with looking at how we improve agriculture, because it is primarily a female-based pursuit. So there are 4 of the boxes. The 5th box, if you look at productivity currently, one finds that on average in Africa, about 40% of what is grown never makes it to a consumer. There's a huge post-harvest loss. And one of the new things and exciting things is to balance productivity on farm with post-harvest activities. So that 5th box is post-harvest. And in post-harvest in agriculture, there are 3 functions of post-harvest. They are storage, processing, and transportation. People want food or agricultural goods when they want them, so they often have to be stored until that time. They want them how they want them, so they often need to go through some transformation or processing. And they want them where they want them, transportation to move them. And these 3 things interact with each other in a variety of ways. One often might have on-farm storage of a crop so that it is not all released on the market at the same time. And it may be transported to a place where it is processed, then stored another time and transported to a place where it's consumed. So that pattern of how those 3 interact is very different for each crop and very different for each place. One of the basic things that one learns is that in processing generally involves reducing moisture and adding moisture. So one grows a crop and one brings the moisture content down on rice or maize. And then after it's processed, one might add water to it. That helps to govern where and how it's transported and where processing takes place. The 6th box is market and trade. And in markets and trade, as I've pointed out, those 3 post-harvest activities and the movement to those post-harvest activities is all about marketing and all about trading. But one of the critical things we're finding is that trading works best when it is larger than an individual country. So particularly as we look at markets and trading, we're paying some attention to what are subregions, West Africa is a subregion. East Africa is a subregion. South Asia is a subregion. Southern Africa is a subregion. Because that is what allows the various agricultural products, including livestock and fish, to move from places where they are grown to places where they are consumed. And the seventh box is governance. Governance is critically important. That's what helps to determine what the policies are, that helps to determine who it is who is advising on policies and the degree of participation of civil society and major groups. It is what gives us the economics governance that allows markets to really work. So that seventh box is governance. Those are generally the areas that we are looking at for a renewed emphasis in agriculture, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Franklin. Very fascinating and informative. Ambassador Bockari Stevens has come in just on cue and on time. I hope he's prepared. But as I understand it, Ambassador, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I know you have limited time. I think you're not going to be able to stay for the questions and answers, but that you were going to make a few remarks on African leadership response to the food security issues. You haven't had the advantage of hearing the earlier presentations, but okay. Okay. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I won't be long, and I will just be repeating. I'm sorry for those who were at the Rayburn House this morning. Maybe I might be very repetitive in what I said there.
The rest of us also have.
I'm the ambassador for Sierra Leone in the United States of America, and the food crisis last year actually energized most of the African countries into taking their own destiny in their own hands. We have received considerable support from the United States of America, and but we think the responsibility and the onus lies upon us as Africans ourselves to be able to feed ourselves. We have, before the crisis, growth in Africa was almost about 10%, and across the board in all of African countries it was about 5%. This didn't come from thin air. It came as a result of constructive and deliberate policies, good governance, democratic reforms, which paid off for African countries. But of course, most of these gains were diminished because of the global financial crisis, global food shortage. As I said this morning, if you have a crisis in Europe or in America, for us in Africa, it's a disaster and it's a catastrophe, because we don't have the luxury of subsidies, we don't have the luxury of bailouts. We have been suffering for all these years. Sometimes when we go out, when you're in the Western world, you go to parties and you see the amount of food that has been wasted. Almost every African in Europe or in Africa, straight away you reflect back home and said, oh my God, if I can gather all of this and send it to home, how many people will I be able to save? And it's not textbook. People are suffering. I personally know a lot of people who go without food for days in Africa. So, but as I said, the lesson that we learned from the food crisis is that we can do it if we have the willpower, if we have the partnership. We are not, I don't think African countries come again to beg for aid. What we want is partnership, private sector investment, to be able to get our farmers empowered, get our women empowered to be able to produce themselves. And I think we are seeing results. I come from Sierra Leone, and in almost every African country now, agriculture has been prioritized as the most important project. Certainly in my country, it's our #1 priority. And every resources of governance from the president and is geared towards For us, we want to feed ourselves in 2 years' time and be able to produce enough to export to other countries. We did it in colonial period. During the colonial days, many African countries used to export rice. So we think we should be able to do. But what we need is partnership, private sector investment, so that we can be able to work together in order to develop. I think I was hearing the leader of the United States saying everywhere if there's hunger in Africa, it's a problem for the United States. It's a problem for the world. Because I spent a long time in England, and we have lots of Africans killing themselves to go to Europe and things like that. And they place enormous burden on the social services requirement of these countries. If these people had enough to eat, they were gainfully employed, nobody would want to come to Europe, because we think we are better in our own countries than out here. So I won't say too long. If there are questions, I'll be able to answer, and that's what I'll have to contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We will turn to questions and answers now. This has been a fascinating and very varied presentation. I'm struck in many ways by some of the things that have been said, but particularly where Roger began, that chronic hunger is man-made. I think we are talking about issues of leadership here, as well as technological, as well as the 7 boxes, I'm sorry, and the various issues that need to be addressed. But let's welcome questions. Point your questions to the ambassador first, but the whole panel will pick them up. I know that Marshall also has to leave a little bit early, so we'll lose him a little bit. And in terms of U.S. leadership on rebuilding U.S. leadership on agriculture and food hunger, I know you have some thoughts on that from your background. The Woodrow Wilson policy is that I'll recognize you. Wait for a microphone to come your way, because this is being webcast. We want you to be identifying yourself as soon as you get your microphone. I see the first hand at the back here. We'll take 3 questions at a time. Next in the back here, and one in the front here.
Yeah, Jim Fisher Thompson, America.gov, State Department. I'd like to direct my question to the ambassador first, and then the other panelists. You know, as you know, President Obama pledged $3.5 billion, I think, for food aid in Africa at the Italian conference, and he was at the G8, and then later reiterated that during his Ghana speech on his Africa trip. Now we have an upcoming visit by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to Africa to attend the AGOA conference in Nairobi, and then to visit 7 African nations from August 5th to about the 14th. I'd like you to comment, sir, Mr. Ambassador, on the importance of that trip. Do you think it will be a factor in focusing attention, you know, on food security in the continent?
I tell you what, as that one is very specific to the ambassador, let's go ahead and take an answer on that, sir, and then we'll go to the other questions. Yeah.
The AGOA, I will be attending the AGOA summit, so as well as many African ambassadors in Nairobi. And it's a very important initiative of President George Bush. And many African countries have a lot of hope that AGOA is going to work. Some have taken advantage of it, others have not. But also to say that the visit of the Secretary of State coming on the heels of the visit of the President of America, it shows, it's a symbol for us, Africa, that yes, maybe now America has taken Africa very seriously. Going to Liberia gives us hope, because what affects Liberia affects Sierra Leone, and we are both countries coming from decades of civil war. So we are happy that she's going there. She's going to see for herself, and we honestly think that it's hope for us. The speech that President Obama gave in Ghana was very wide-ranging. I mean, the emphasis was on that if we are ready to work, if we have good governance, if we have the structures in place for democracy, America is a willing partner for Africa. So yes, I would say we're looking forward to it with great optimism.
Any other panel comments on that question?
I would make just 2 quick comments. First, the $3.5 billion is for agricultural assistance, not food assistance. There's a difference between those 2 things. But he talked about agricultural assistance. And 2 things on the Secretary's visit. I think the Secretary actually, during her visit, intends to spend some time specifically on food security, and we'll do some site visits that are food security related on site visits. Within the AGOA, you know, the AGOA is really about trade between Africa and the United States. But increasingly, we are also using it as a forum to have some discussions about inter-African trade. And in agriculture, as I pointed out, inter-African trade is critically important. Getting the markets right and getting production, often the breadbasket to an area is in a different country than the consuming area, for natural consuming area for that breadbasket. So the ability to increase trade within Africa, particularly as it relates to foodstuffs, is critically important. And there actually will be some discussion of that during the AGOA sessions themselves.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's turn to the next question.
Is it on? My name is Henok Fante from the Voice of America. My question goes to the authors of the book. You have shown a picture of a grain merchant in Davrazet or Nazareth. I just wanted to ask if you took the roles of local business people, merchants, into your writing in your book. I'm asking this because you have given analysis, a possible explanation of a policy from the Western government side, but the contribution of local markets, for example, some of these farmers, as I have learned in some of my reporting, is that they were hoarding excess produce, waiting for better prices. So I wonder if you took the role of local business people. The same thing happened with after the foundation of the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange. Leni Government is facing a problem, stiff opposition actually, from these organized farmers, who merchants, who want to push the price up. So that's my question.
Thank you very much.
I'll start. And then
You want to take?
Yeah, let's take
okay,
a
I'm
couple.
sorry.
Yeah, let's one right in front here. Hoop. And then the next one, Justine, will be the person you tripped over. No, right in front. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm going in the order of raised hands.
Oh.
We'll get back to you. Don't worry.
My name is Edu Otu. I'm an independent journalist. And since the days of President Clinton, I have been reporting on U.S.-related, Africa-related agricultural issues right here in Washington, D.C. And sometimes I get disappointed and sometimes I get bored because I've been listening to the same things, same issues, same solutions, same ideas since 19-something. And now we are here in 2009 talking about, as a matter of fact, Mr. McDonald will recall about a month and a half ago, Partnership to Cut Hunger had a program right here, and we talked about the same things. So my question is, how are we going to get there? When?
Good, fair question. Okay, one more at the side there, Justine, up there.
I'm Charles Taylor, a visiting scholar at the Population Reference Bureau.
Everyone from Liberia.
Charles Taylor as a name has quite a different
Right.
meaning if you come from Sierra Leone. That's why we're laughing.
I was researching in Liberia when he invaded from
Okay.
Guinea, and I had to get out of there. Having worked many years on problems of hunger and malnutrition, I want to comment both on the book and on Mr. Moore's integrating malnutrition into poverty and hunger is important. I happen to have worked on and lived in Ethiopia from 1992 to 2003 and then keep teaching there. I think the book is important in raising the issue, in the outrage, but I think you also need to inspire with what has been done there since the 1984 famine and 1992, and particularly the 2000 famine, which we researched to death, and the difference between the 2000-2003 famine. 2000 famine, there was a lot of excess mortality due to the conditions. But by 2003, what had been put in place by partnership, the government, civil society, and the international organizations, the excess mortality was greatly reduced. And this has been documented by our research at Addis Ababa University. I think one of the big myths is that food kills children, that hunger kills children. But in fact, it's disease and malnutrition that kills the very young. And the very young are fed by breastfeeding and small porridges and childcare and multiple factors. And that's why I'd like to commend what Franklin Moore was saying about the importance of adding malnutrition to the equation, because the only way that you're going to reduce excess mortality and deaths from hunger is to see what was done between 2000 and 2003, the success story in reducing excess mortality. It was in Boricha where the pictures were taken that we have evaluated, and the main reason was the measles vaccination. That was the main killer before, plus clean water and growth monitoring programs. So those were the main reasons reducing excess mortality. The food that came in is too late. So finally, I think the evaluations that also have been done show that you do not reduce starvation and mortality through food aid. Most of the evaluations of food aid show it's really for humanitarian purposes. But if you really want to reduce mortality, it takes a multi-sectoral approach. And finally, MDG on Ethiopia. Our students this year have analyzed all 24 of the MDG indicators from 1990 to 2007. The MDG 1 indicator, which is reducing poverty and indirectly to reduce undernutrition. And they are meeting the MDG, they are on track to meet the MDG track. That should inspire, in spite of the warfare and the droughts, the climate change, the environmental problems, and all the other governance and leadership issues, it's still on track. So a second plea from a researcher is, let's look at the data and see where these countries are succeeding, even in spite of the tremendous problems in a place like the Horn of Africa. And
Okay, thank you very much. Because my associate tripped over you, I gave you a little extra time there, because I didn't hear a question in there, but that's all right. It was good information. Let's let the panel pick up on these, I think, starting first with the how about local markets and merchants. And I think, Franklin, you may have something to say on the second question. How do we get there from here?
Well, can you hear me?
Yep.
The example in Ethiopia, I bore Roger to tears because I'm the market geek and I like numbers and I cover agriculture, and our offices are in Chicago, across from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So I follow the futures markets, and the complaint can be that some farmers are hoarding grain because they want prices to go up, but that's what farmers do. In the United States, they don't call it hoarding. They say that they're not pulling their grain out of storage. Of course, they have something to store. The issue in Ethiopia was, and the point we're trying to make is that the way the food aid system works is it's a very blunt instrument, that by the time the U.S. government realizes that there's a need for increased food aid and the bidding goes out and the grain is sourced in the wheat sourced in Kansas or the soybeans in Iowa, and it goes down the Mississippi River and it's put in burlap bags, or not burlap anymore, in these bags, and shipped across the ocean and arrive in the port and get into the hunger areas, months and months have passed. And by that time, oftentimes you're in another season. And so, you know, the United States is incredibly generous and gets and should get a lot of credit for that. But the way the food aid system works now, and administrators of the USAID have complained about this, is that by the time they're able to get food to many places that need it, months have passed since the problem actually began. And one of the problems that can occur when the food aid does arrive, particularly if another season has passed, is that it comes in and it swamps the market and depresses prices. So you actually end up doing something you never intended, which is to distort the local market. So because farmers are not able to, what we have in the United States, they can use futures markets and forward hedge forward price. It leaves them vulnerable to these kinds of distortions. Do you want us to, and Roger is actually in Ethiopia. I'm just opining.
Yeah, and I'll also talk about the Eleni situation. There were the charges of the guys that we shown and others, the hoarding charge. Their response was, just as Scott said, that's what farmers do. They had no other mechanism. There were no futures contracts, anything else to deal with their grain. As I said, prices already collapsed 80%. You know, my goodness, if they would have released all the other grain that they had and put it on the market, they know prices are even going to go fall even further. At that time, I think there was misunderstanding of that, particularly of the role of the market mechanisms and a distrust of it, of the Ethiopian government at the time. And I think that through the emergence of the commodity exchange, there's been a very good dialogue and I think education throughout the country of the role of the farmers, the traders, and the farming mechanisms and the incentive that it can give. And it's precisely that the image or the thought of hoarding that Eleni's system is trying to overcome. And the traders that aren't participating in it, I'm not sure if they still fully understand that. But by delivering their grain to the market and to her commodities warehouses, they have the ability that can be stored there, and they can sell it at any time. I mean, it can be the commodity exchange that in essence does the hoarding, or sits on it until there is a price that these guys figure is legitimate and that they can have. There's also plenty in the book about the private sector. So the voices of the commercial traders, of the farmers, of the private sector is kind of in full flight in the book.
And
Franklin, did you?
Franklin and Ambassador too. I mean, is it the same old, or are we getting anywhere?
No, let me point out a couple things that are different. I won't go into great detail, but I'll point out one. One, on a partner side, certainly Africans have clearly understood the problem allows there to be country-led plans that others can invest in. So that's a change. Two other critical changes, I think, are that donors as a group are looking at strategic coordination and the use of global partnerships. So in many cases in the past, when a country was dealing with 7 different donors who had different disbursement rates, et cetera, there is a commitment on the part of donor nations that we will organize ourselves in a way that is very different than the way we have behaved in the past. So those are two things that I think are greatly different in comparing what could happen in agriculture now and comparing it to 10 years ago, for example. I could go on with some other things, but those are two critical ones.
Ambassador?
I think it's all I could have said. Just to add that, especially in West Africa, it's regional groupings are now working together, especially in agricultural development, like the Mano River Union. For the first time, they've been able to sit down to discuss as to how they can exchange trade, how they can, to avoid the duplication of efforts. They are now working together in agricultural development. ECOWAS is another area that they're working together. So it's.
But I'll throw in. I mean, I understand why you're skeptical. I mean, the West has made there's a long history of broken promises, of promises of aid since the Food Summit in 1996. Goals that have been set that haven't been met on hunger, and money that's been promised and not delivered. And the Obama administration is talking a lot more about hunger in the early days of its administration than we've seen past administrations. But the test will be what they deliver, and we don't know the answer to that yet. And we're going to certainly be interested in following it. But I do believe, though, that by the time I was probably more pessimistic when I started the book, and into the book more optimistic that we can make a difference. And some of the reasons are in Africa, that democracy is spreading and is taking hold, and that I think Roger and I are aware that there's more of a grassroots movement. People have nothing to do with government, but are in their church or college students, private individuals, the Gates Foundations, the Buffetts, the little old ladies in the Birmingham church who care about this issue now and care deeply about it. Have nothing to do with USAID, the State Department, or the USDA. And I think that's a fascinating change, and one we want to watch. Then there's one unanswered question that...
Charles Taylor's question, I think
Good.
Roger was going to pick up
I'll
on
get
a
into
couple
that.
of aspects of that.
And also the things that Franklin and the ambassador were talking about, both political leadership and the thinking on the political level in both the United States and what the administration is trying to do and what they're talking about in the G8. And as the ambassador talks about the engagement more and more of African leadership, I think a lot of that is new on the fronts that they talked about. And then what Charles was asking, in certain parts of the book, I think we do recognize the progress that's been made, not only in Ethiopia but in other countries in Africa. Certainly the productive safety net system that was put into play, even starting after 1984, the FuseNet and the early famine, early warning system that came out of that, which you're absolutely right, really decreased the amount of deaths that happen when the famine does come, because we can see it coming and should be able to react better to it. So at least the food aid is on its way. There is example of that, and you're right that the food aid, it's there. By the time it comes, it's too late. And I think one thing that Norman Borlaug said that was also kind of a guiding thing, for us. He said that too often, with pious regret, we pick up the pieces. We pick up the human wreckage of famine, and that's what that is. And so that's why Borlaug's push was to get on top of famine so it doesn't happen to begin with. Then I would just say, and then also we talk about the development of things like plumping nut, which were emerging starting to emerge in 2000, and then certainly the 2003 famine, and one sees in Sudan and the Darfur really being deployed, and the beneficial effect of the micronutrients. Plumping nut is a way to develop, to deliver the treatment for the severely malnourished kids that we saw in basically a peanut butter paste. So they can be treated at home, which is the great revolutionary aspect of it, instead of bringing them into the emergency feeding tents, because the minute they're in the emergency feeding tents, and as we said, there's 166 of them in 3 tents, they're coming in there with all sorts of diseases that you talked about. The minute you start, and before the plumping nut, it was the emergency feeding was basically delivered. It was a water-based or milk-based system. The minute you open that up and you start doing it, it becomes a brew for all sorts of disease and infections.
Which is a French invention, right?
The plumping nut, right? Well, the disease and infection. I thought you were saying that. We can blame them for everything. The little squat toilets and all sorts of stuff.
You guys have obviously worked too long together.
Well, we finish each other's sentences. But anyway, the whole importance of micronutrients that we also deal with and the new kind of progressive and new delivery mechanisms for that is really important. So you make some really good points, and hopefully you'll find glimpses of them in the book as you go through.
Okay, well, before we take the next round of questions, I just want to excuse Marshall. He does have to leave early, and thank him again for helping to co-sponsor this with the Chicago Council and for all the work you did on this. Well, my first question is just leaving. Yes, right here. We were going to take a question from you first. Behind you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Sekero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow and Sekero's International Group. I come from Kenya, and I'm based here in Washington, D.C. I thank the panelists for all they have spoken. You know, as I can say, Africa is not poor. Africa is the richest, and it's only the technology and people to partner to work. We are coming up with agriculture technology, where our model will be based in Kenya, and then we'll duplicate into other African countries to fight poverty. As a woman who was born and raised in Africa, I would not wait to hear people talk Africa is poor people. We see people dying, as Mr. He has talked that everybody has taken an initiative. You have, whether you are USID, anybody, you can make a difference into people. So, Mr. Ambassador, as a woman born and raised in Africa, including you, we can come up in Sierra Leone, Kenya, and work and fight poverty. We don't have to wait for Wilson Woodley to come and fight for us poverty. We can do it. We can make it. It's just training, tools, and money, finances to support. But we are going without money. We need all your support, and I'll be inviting you to our event where we'll be demonstrating our technology of agriculture. We'll work with small farmers. We'll have cooperatives from small farmers and then big cooperatives for processing, packaging, and just for export. And we don't only look at poverty. Also, we look into things like roads, infrastructure, energy, solar energy that brings all that to fight poverty. So we really need your support, and thank you very much to bring this discussion here.
Thank you very much, and you'll get a chance to talk to them after the event is ended. I had a next question, was right here in the middle somewhere. I think that was it, yeah.
Thank you. Wes Cryle from the Foundation for Environmental Security and Sustainability. I was glad to hear Mr. Moore finally bring up the natural resource conservation aspect of all this agricultural innovation. And I'm wondering, I guess a question for the authors of the book, did you look at any of the innovations going on in Africa as far as silvopastoral systems that's integrating, agroforestry systems, sustainable agriculture on a smallholder scale that isn't necessarily, the big Monsantos, the big mechanized, high input continuation of the Green Revolution that you hear so much about. And then for Mr. Moore, I was wondering if mentioning that is one of the boxes, natural resource conservation, is there any push to examine or to put research into permaculture, various agricultural systems that rely on limited resources, limited irrigation, limited technologies that can sustain that 60% of the families that live on enough land to support themselves. And I guess that's it.
Okay, yeah. 2 has already doubled your limit. The next question, that's all right here. Yes.
My name is Alpha Diallo. I'm a microbiologist. So as such, I'm only used to deal with mortality and morbidity weekly reports. I'm happy to be here and to listen to the shock and what do you call it, discussion that we have, that you have brought up in bringing the examples of Ethiopian famine, and showed Mali as another example. But I think that what is most important as a microbiologist and also as a scientist involved in international development, I'd like to commend Mr. Franklin Moore's 7 boxes, and hope that the ambassador will take home the fact that box number 7 is the most important part of what is involved in, if we have to have any hope in African development. Box number 7 is the role of governments, good governance, policies, and an application of scientific research in establishing policies either of health or for development. The next thing I noticed within my last 30 years in this country is that there is a plethora of help. Everybody says we are helping the African countries and underdeveloped countries. It is not the help. It is how we are approaching help that is the impediment to development in Africa, or at least development in the areas of Africa that I have had experience with. We have a plethora of donor countries and donor organizations that do not, in most instances, consult. And consultation and coordination at the level of a country, not coordination just at the level of Washington or New York, but going to the country and asking what is a priority for the governments. I understand that people have the tendency is, well, the African government is of no consequence, or you could always bribe. No, whether they are a what do you call it, a soldier's government, or whether they are a government which is legitimate or illegitimate, does not matter. What matters is that they represent a group of people, and as long as there is no consultation with the governments and establishment of priorities based on the needs of the people, we will always be in this circle.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate the comments, and we'll get to it. Down here, Steve.
Hi, Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I think one of the miracles of this particular initiative, the Food Security Initiative, was that it was done within 6 months of a new administration assuming power, of which one of the leading agencies did not have a head, at least as far as I know, doesn't have a head yet. So congratulations for the work that was done on that particular initiative. I have two quick and short questions. One is, how does the new Food Security Initiative relate to the CADIP program, which I know was mentioned and so on, et cetera, which had its own particular basis? And two, how does a food security program relate to comparative advantage, meaning in cases where a country could produce an export crop, perhaps more efficiently, theory, as you know, being that with the foreign exchange earnings, they would bring back in they would get more money and then be able to buy more food and so on, given the fact, however, that has been abused in many different ways. What is the relationship between those two concepts? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. A lot of things to chew on there. Who would like to start?
I'll take the first one, the question about the natural resources. So yes, in the book we do look at how agricultural development could work in Africa, and how it should coexist with the environment. And the thing that guides us is that the Green Revolution, that term is actually very controversial in some circles because it connotates heavy fertilizer use and heavy pesticide use and pollution of the waterways, all of which happened in Asia with the first Green Revolution. Scientists didn't know as much as they know now about how much plants need to take up from the soil. And so over those decades, we've actually learned that plants, in many cases, need less. In the United States, certainly, the farmers have become more precise, although we still have the dead zone in south of New Orleans, which is partly related to chemical runoff. What we argue is oftentimes we don't even refer to a green revolution in Africa because it's so associated with Asia, but agricultural development and an agricultural revolution in Africa, which is a lot harder than what happened in Asia, as Franklin pointed out too. Africa is a lot different and a lot more difficult to try to increase food production across the continent because there are a lot more different types of soil types and climate, and people depend on a lot more different kinds of crops than they do in Africa than they did in Asia then. But some of the things we look at, we talk about is no-till agriculture, for example, where you try not to disturb the soil. We look at drought-resistant corn, using biotechnology to try to create drought-resistant corn. Howard Buffett is used in the book to talk about how he's basically a commercial farmer in the Midwest who uses a lot of chemicals and fertilizer, and so he's very dependent on petrochemicals. And his experience tells him that that's not the kind of agriculture you want to bring to Africa, because if you understand that petrochemicals in the future are only going to become more scarce and prices are only going to become more vulnerable, why would you want to commit the continent to that kind of agriculture? You have to find other ways to do it. Did you want to say anything else?
Nope, that's fine.
I think the question on on consultation, government consultation, the governance issue deserves some response. Franklin and Ambassador, maybe you can elaborate.
Well, let me say a couple quick things about a couple of the pieces. First, for the guy from FES. In terms of technologies, here are, and they have kind of been covered, but here are three that are critical and important. First, what one would call crop for drop. So how is water applied best, and how is water applied in ways that conserve that water is critically important. Soil viability, whether it is through conservation agriculture, which was referred to as no-till agriculture, or with carbon supplements to soil. I mean, as we look at the cross between climate change and agriculture, there will be some roles and potentially some possibility that climate change's preoccupation with carbon may help to increase carbon sequestration in agricultural soils, and both water and the other things that crops need work much better in a higher carbon content. And the third one is looking at multi-use food fodder crops. Those are three technologies that are critically important for small farmers. If I might, the comments that were made about governance, yeah, I mean, I agree with them. Governance is critically important, not just political governance, but economic governance. The governance that allows deals to be made, contracts to be signed and adhered to, is that portion of governance that will attract the private sector. And much of what I talked about in post-harvest is very dependent upon the private sector in some form. So the governance that determines sort of democracy in governance and determines civil society participation in decision making is critical, but so is the economic governance. Last, the concept of comparative advantage. As one looks at food insecurity, there are two aspects of food insecurity that are critical. One is access to food and the other is availability. Availability has a lot more to do with increasing the productivity of an area, Africa, for example, in terms of their production of staple food crops. But yes, comparative advantage is critically important, because if I can grow some export crop and it provides me with an income where food is available, it allows me to have access to it. So access and availability are both critical portions of food security, and comparative advantage certainly does help on the access side.
Ambassador, would you like to?
I only want to add that in terms of governance, I think Africa is making a big leap. There are few areas still of concern, but I mean, take West Africa, for example. We had democratic elections in Sierra Leone in 2007, where the present government was able to overthrow a sitting government. We had democratic elections in Ghana. We had democratic elections in Liberia. These are all examples that we are showing. And I think the empowerment of the women folk in most of these areas is a very sure sign for development, and also the empowerment of young people, and also the anti-corruption drive in many of these areas. Many of the ministers and permanent secretaries are now afraid to do under the table deals, because I mean, they've set examples, like in my country, they've set very bright examples where very senior people have been sentenced to prison for corruption. That sends the right message. So I'm not saying we are there, but I think we are getting there. What I wanted to add was the role of the diaspora. The diaspora in Africa is very, very important for us. The total amount of money coming from Europe and America going to the African continent is almost 2 or 3 times more than the total aid that is going to those countries. So the diaspora, many African countries are now taking specific initiatives to be able to appeal to the diaspora to serve as an engine of growth. Encourage them to go and set up in the private sector to help in agriculture and things like that. We have, my country is one for that. We have more qualified people in the United States of America than we have in Sierra Leone. We have people who are agriculturists who have very good degrees, but they are here doing jobs that are not related to what they are trained for. These are the kind of things we want. The World Bank is helping in this to be able to not only to get them to go back, say, okay, come and spend a few months back home, and then do some work, then you can come back, or try to get companies from this country to go and help. So if we are able to tap the diaspora effectively, that can also provide an engine of growth for us in Africa.
That's a very interesting point you end on there, Ambassador, and I just want to say that the Woodrow Wilson Center's Africa program is looking at putting on a program in a few months' time on the role of the diaspora, both in conflict as well as in development. I think extremely interesting point. I'm also going to let the Ambassador be the last formal word on this. I normally feel very bad when I stop a program because we have so many questions wanting to be asked, but this time we have the luxury of being able to go outside, have a drink, and keep on talking. So let us thank our panelists, and let us join us on the outside.